Masterpiece is not a word I use lightly, but sometimes it's the only word that fits. Hello Booktube, I'm Jonathan, and today I'm going to be talking about Kindred by Octavia E. Butler. Now, to provide some context, this is the fourth book I've read by Butler. The first was Wild Seed, which didn't quite click for me, and then I read Dawn and The Parable of the Sower, both of which I thought were very good. I gave both of those 4 stars. So I was going into Kindred expecting to like it, but I wasn't expecting it to become an all-time favorite, which it did. So let's try and unpack that. Let's try and decipher why I ended up connecting with Kindred so strongly and why I recommend it so much. Well, to start, what is Kindred about? Well, a woman named Dana, who is a black woman, lives in Los Angeles in the year 1976. And one day she is transported back in time to a plantation in Maryland in the early 1800s. And she has no control over this time travel, and she is pulled back and forth between these two timelines on several occasions, and she has to learn to adapt to living in what is clearly a very different environment and lifestyle and sort of life experience for her back in what was slave times. Now, obviously, when dealing with a topic like slavery, there are going to be some rather intense themes and uncomfortable situations put on the page. And I've kind of been going through the emotional ringer recently, as not too long ago I read some books from The Gap Cycle by Stephen R. Donaldson, which is kind of a grimdark space opera. And in a review for that, I said that the content, the sort of subject matter in terms of kind of how graphic was, I put it at about a 9 out of 10. I'm going to rate Kindred probably something similar. There's definitely some pretty visceral and unsettling scenes depicted in the book. Now, there was a moment that I thought to myself while reading this that facial expressions are a communication tool. Humans use facial expressions to communicate things with other people. So there wasn't really any reason to be making facial expressions while reading a book, and yet sometimes I just couldn't help myself. I was so impacted by what I was reading, I was physically reacting to what was happening on the page. So I definitely formed a connection and sort of reacted to what was going on in the book. I will say, though, that a difference between Kindred and something like the Gap Cycle is the sort of atrocities that you were experiencing in the book. In Kindred, they are from the perspective of the victim, whereas in the Gap Cycle, you are seeing those things described from the perspective of the perpetrator. And so there's something particularly unsettling about the Gap Cycle, whereas in Kindred, even though it was pretty shocking, it was a little bit easier to get through because there was a little bit more to root for. You sort of in the mindset of someone that you're just sort of begging, hoping, praying can get out of these certain situations. Now you might be thinking, Jonathan, this sounds like a rather unpleasant read. It doesn't sound very fun. Is it something that I really need to experience and read through in order to learn that slavery was bad? Because I already know that slavery was bad. And I would say if that was just the takeaway, that was the theme, then I don't think this book would be as highly regarded as it is. I think there is a lot of nuance here and a lot of layers and a lot to explore. This book has been picked up in a lot of academic classes and reading environments like that. So I'm sure there's a lot that you can take from this book. I'm sure I didn't get everything on a first read, but I just wanted to share some of the themes that I picked up on while reading Kindred. One of the really interesting aspects to me in the book was the ways in which something like slavery can become normalized. In the timeline of the 1800s, we have characters which might not necessarily be inherently bad or evil, but they do some pretty monstrous things. And how these sort of monstrosities become run of the mill because we have laws that allow them to happen, or we have social norms that promote them, or even make people think that they are just or righteous. And then another fascinating element was the ways in which victims can be forced into accepting their situation. So people looking at this from a modern perspective, like the main character Dana, so she is taken from the 1970s, and of course there's a lot of still sort of racial issues, things going on in the 1970s, but it's a much more modern experience. Things have changed a lot since the 1800s. Someone like her might think, well, I know all about this time period, I know what's right, I would never let that happen to me. But then when you're put in that situation, when you do have a limited amount of power and you are faced with the real consequences of pain and oppression and threats and things like that, how quickly you get stripped of the things that make you you. You get stripped of the things that you think you are capable of. And so we have this situation where people might think, oh, I would never do anything to oppress anyone, or if I was the person being oppressed, I wouldn't let it happen to me. But things aren't always that easy, and things certainly aren't that simple for our main character, Dana. And in the story, Dana also has a familial connection to the people on the plantation in the early 1800s. So there is this ancestral connection. There are racial connections, issues to do with gender as well, but not just for Dana, but America as a whole. I don't think it's a coincidence that the present timeline takes place in 1976, 200 years after 1776. So I think something the book does really well is explore these themes in a nuanced and layered way on both a micro and macro level. So something else that I really enjoyed in the book was the character writing, both the depth of character, the character arcs, and the character relationships. I think something that I noticed in a couple of other Butler books is that sometimes her main characters can be a little bit passive, and not every character has to be the hero that makes all the grand heroic decisions, but I do like it when characters make strong decisions that reveal things about them as people and sort of force the story to go in interesting directions. And Butler definitely does that here with Kindred. I really enjoyed reading Dana as a character because she is someone that doesn't necessarily have a ton of options. It's not easy to be the hero in her situation, but even if they're small decisions, they're important decisions and brave decisions. And I got so invested in her journey, and I think the decisions that she makes help drives the plot in some interesting directions. Now, an important part of the novel is that Dana is actually married, and she is married to a white man. So, in a way, they are a team. They have similar goals throughout this kind of terrifying story, but they also are coming at it from completely different perspectives. And I thought Kevin was a really well written character. He is layered. I think he has some positives to him, some negatives to him. I've seen pretty mixed reactions to the character of Kevin. I'd be interested to get your guys' thoughts on him as a character. If you want to join our Discord server, we talk all about sci-fi books. Head in there, drop in your comments on Kindred as a book as a whole, and let me know what you thought of Kevin, because he was kind of divisive. But anyway, I think this character work led to some great story moments. In terms of the plot, Butler does spend a bit of time just sort of describing life on the plantation, and some people might think it can move a little bit slowly at times, but I thought it was masterfully crafted. There's a lot going on, and I feel like the plot kind of simmers, 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 and then explodes. Simmers, 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 and then explodes. And there were some kind of endings to some of the chapters where I was just on the edge of my seat, and I just had to keep on reading. Now, something else that I enjoyed about Butler's plotting was I think she masterfully lays the groundwork for things. There are several threads that she ties together. There are little moments of foreshadowing. So sometimes you get this sort of eerie sense that something is about to happen, and then she delivers on it. And then sometimes she'll just deliver something out of nowhere as a complete surprise. So in terms of the plotting, if you're a more plot-driven reader, I think this is still the Butler book that I would recommend to you. Now, in terms of the writing style, Butler is famous for having relatively straightforward prose, which I think is something that typically works well in her books because the subject matter is usually rather heavy. So if she just tells you things in a rather matter-of-fact manner, it lets the outcomes, the themes, whatever is happening on the page kind of come to the center. The focus is on what is happening rather than kind of feeling the need to dress it up with the way she writes. It's powerful enough as it is. And I think she does that here. I do think that Kindred is still relatively straightforward and it's quite readable, but I particularly love the writing in this one. I think there's some really powerful moments and a number of times where I just stopped to reread a quote, and there were quite a few impactful quotes that really got to me in Kindred. I just want to give you an example of one of them. She went to him. She adjusted, became a quieter, more subdued person. She didn't kill, but she seemed to die a little. And there were a number of moments like this, which to be honest, kind of just made me want to die a little inside, but at the same time, it also connected with something human. It made me feel human and made me want to live. And so all of these existential questions and confronting history bring us to a significantly less important question: is this book actually science fiction? Well, I think genres are kind of just broad terms to describe tropes in order to sell books to people through marketing, but seeing as I am a sci-fi guy, this is a sci-fi channel, I will try and share my opinion on whether I think Kindred counts as science fiction. Now, as a trope, time travel is most often associated with science fiction, but I think depending on how the time travel operates, it could be fantasy, it could be science fiction, it kind of depends. So just to give you some examples, let's say a wizard conjures up a potion and a spell in order to transport you back in time. I would probably lean towards calling that fantasy, even though there may be a scientific explanation for that potion and that spell. If it's not provided in the book, if it is viewed as fantastical within that world, that time travel, probably fantasy. Whereas if we have a mad scientist that creates a time machine in order to send you back in time, well, we're obviously going to call that science fiction. So where does time travel land on this scale in Kindred? Well, I don't think it's too much of a spoiler to say that the time travel is mostly left unexplained. There isn't a particularly detailed explanation for the time travel. So what do? Well, I think in this case, the tie goes to the runner. Seeing as time travel is generally considered to be a sci-fi trope, I'm going to claim it. I'm going to say that Kindred is science fiction. Although if you disagreed and wanted to say this isn't really science fiction, I wouldn't fight you too hard on it. Butler herself said that it wasn't really science fiction because it didn't have science in it, which is a pretty good argument, but there are other subgenres like dystopian books or post-apocalyptic books that aren't particularly sciencey either. So I think within the realm of speculative fiction, there are certain tropes which kind of might point you in the direction of fantasy or sci-fi, and so for the sake of wanting this book on my team, Team Sci-Fi, I'm going to say that the time travel elements make it sci-fi. So overall, this was a rather painful book to read, and in terms of unpacking all of these deep themes, I don't think there are necessarily clear-cut answers, but if you go down this road, if you go on this journey, by at least asking those questions, you might come just a little bit closer to understanding and maybe at least find some kind of connection with other humans. I was emotionally overwhelmed by this book. I loved it. No notes. 10 out of 10 from me. So that was a rather serious book. Let's say we have a little fun now as we spin the quantum wheel in order to find out the patron pick of the month for the month of May. Welcome to the quantum wheel, where all of the patron picks are both simultaneously picked and not picked until we observe a winner. Let's find out what I'll be reading in the month of May. Hopefully something just as good, but slightly less stressful and anxiety-inducing than Kindred. Okay, it looks like it might be Shroud, or maybe it'll get the tick. Shroud Hangs On, Shroud by Adrian Tchaikovsky. Okay, so this was actually recently nominated for a Hugo Award, so maybe a good time to be picking this one up. I do like Adrian Tchaikovsky. I think I've read 4 of his novels. I read Children of Time first, and I thought it was fantastic, and nothing has quite lived up to that yet, although it's a pretty high bar. So maybe Shroud will be the one to do it. Check it out. If you're interested in reading Shroud, join us and read it in the month of May. So there you go. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, smash or just gently click the subscribe button. And if you really enjoyed it, consider checking out the perks of becoming a Patreon member, where you can become one of my robots, androids, or cyborgs, like Nima and New Eden, Half-Ogre, Sikawe, Samil, Colin, and the time-traveling Bamsis. And you can find more sci-fi content over here.